It was a sound no one should ever hear, echoing up from a basement, a sharp mechanical grind, followed by a wet, unnatural thump. The garbage compactor had jammed. Again, only this time the smell was wrong. When the maintenance worker opened the hatch, he froze. What he saw didn't make sense. A human leg, torn at odd angles, flesh mangled and twisted like it had been chewed by the metal jaws of a monster. Police were called. Sirens cut through the calm evening air of Melbourne's exclusive Balencia apartment tower, a luxury building of glass and steel where the elite slept soundly, never imagining what horror had just landed in their basement. She was identified quickly. Phoebe Hanschuk, 24. Her body had dropped 6 floors down a narrow garbage chute. She landed feet first, slamming into the industrial compactor with such force that her foot was almost severed from her leg. Internal injuries, catastrophic, but the compactor didn't kill her. That came after. That alone already told me something didn't add up. But there's one more image I can't get out of my head. Her body, bent, broken, lifeless, was lying next to an empty pizza box and crushed wine bottles, a symbol of something cruel and surreal. And while paramedics and officers stood frozen in shock, someone else in the building hadn't even realized she was gone yet. As I stood in the 12th floor apartment where Phoebe lived, I noticed it immediately. The stillness, the strange peace, a half-burned candle flickering on the kitchen bench, her keys on the table, and next to the door, her boots untouched. She didn't leave this apartment the way people normally do. She didn't walk out. She didn't run. She didn't even throw herself out a window. She disappeared down. I walked the hallway to the garbage room, traced her final silent steps. The chute door sat just over waist height. Heavy stainless steel, narrow, barely wide enough for a small adult to squeeze through, and it wasn't clean. Inside, it was lined with jagged metal seams, rusted bolts, and thick grime. How could anyone willingly climb into that, especially barefoot, especially drunk? Investigators said Phoebe had more than 3 times the legal blood alcohol limit in her system. But if she was that intoxicated, how did she manage the balance, the coordination, the sheer strength needed to hoist herself into a raised opening and drop feet first? There were no drag marks, no prints on the edges, and no blood on the hatch's rim, despite her legs being torn open inside the chute. That's when something hit me. This wasn't just a fall. This wasn't even a jump. This was a funnel, cold, sharp, dark, and someone was either desperate enough or driven by something darker to go in. And Phoebe, I realized, didn't have her shoes, because maybe she never planned to leave, or maybe she never got the chance to put them on. She wasn't just a name in a headline, not a tragic footnote in a police report. Phoebe Hanschuk was the kind of person who walked into a room and disrupted the air, messy, magnetic, unpredictable. She had this glow about her, but it wasn't a clean glow. It was raw, flickering, like the flame of a candle that might burn the whole place down. She was 24, with wild hair, words etched in ink on her skin, and notebooks full of poetry she never showed anyone. She sculpted. She danced barefoot on beaches. She quoted Carl Jung and scrawled haunting lines in journals that read like letters to someone long gone. But there was a sadness underneath it all, not always visible, but always present. Friends said she was kind, a listener, a nurturer, but she also vanished sometimes, disappeared into herself. You'd call, and she wouldn't answer for days. Then she'd return with a quiet smile, like nothing had happened. One friend told me Phoebe was half in the light, half in a storm. I looked at old photos, her eyes always fixed on something just outside the frame, as if she saw things others didn't, as if she knew something the rest of us never would. And maybe she did. Anthony Hampel. He's not the kind of man you forget easily. 43 years old, polished, confident, a man with the kind of quiet power that doesn't have to shout. Son of a former Supreme Court judge, criminal defense lawyer, event promoter, a man who moved in circles that never touched the ground. When I first saw him on camera, he looked composed, a little too composed, shirt crisp, voice flat, eyes dull like glass. He'd been dating Phoebe for over a year, lived with her in that high-rise apartment. But when police asked how long she'd been missing, he wasn't sure. That's the moment I froze. Not sure. He said he came home from work, found a broken glass, the dog loose, and assumed Phoebe had just stepped out. But hours passed. Then he went to the gym, still didn't call her, didn't text, didn't seem to worry. It wasn't until the police knocked on the door that he claimed to sense something was wrong. That struck me, because people who love deeply, they know when something's wrong. But Anthony, he seemed more concerned with the optics, the timeline, the tone of his answers. And here's the twist. Phoebe had told friends she wanted to leave him. She was planning to move out. She felt suffocated, controlled. One friend said Phoebe told her she didn't feel like herself anymore. And that's where I started to wonder. If she was breaking free, who or what stopped her? There were weekends Phoebe would vanish, not just from her apartment, but from the world. No texts, no calls. Her phone would ring and ring. Then suddenly she'd be back, sitting in a cafe with a friend like nothing happened, laughing, talking about music or her latest dream or a book she was writing. But friends noticed the pattern. Every time she came back, she seemed thinner, paler, apologetic. "I'm sorry," she'd whisper. "I just needed to get away." Some said she was haunted, like she was trying to outrun a shadow only she could see. Others said she was being controlled, that Anthony kept tabs on her, checked her location, questioned her about her whereabouts. And then there were the sleepwalking episodes. Phoebe had a history of it documented in her psychiatric records. She once woke up outside her apartment building in the middle of the night with no memory of how she got there. Another time, she cut her foot and had no idea when or how it happened. One friend told me Phoebe kept a journal to track her blackouts, that some pages were just scribbles. Others were full of poetry she didn't remember writing. Was she dissociating, being drugged, or just unraveling under the weight of her own mind? I can't answer that yet, but I know those weekends weren't escapes. They were warning signs, and no one heard them in time. December 2nd, 2010. It started quietly. Phoebe picked up her phone, ordered dinner from her favorite Thai place, fed her dog Yoshi, even emailed a coworker about switching a shift. It was normal, but it was too normal. The kind of normal you perform when you're trying to look okay. The kind of routine that hides the chaos swelling just beneath the skin. She lit candles in the apartment, played soft music, opened a bottle of wine. To relax, to prepare, or to say goodbye. Here's what makes this day so strange. Nothing about her behavior screamed crisis. No wild messages, no breakdowns, no tearful goodbyes. But there was one thing. She texted Anthony's dad, whom she was close to, "Thanks for everything. Love you." That message read like a bow being tied on something unfinished. And when I picture her in that dim apartment, candlelight dancing off the walls, wine glass in hand, I wonder, was she trying to calm herself? Or was she waiting for someone? Because just hours later, she would be found broken and lifeless, crushed beneath 6 floors of silence. And no one knows what truly happened between that candle's flame and the chute's cold mouth. It's one of the most high-tech buildings in Melbourne. Security cameras on nearly every floor, elevator logs, swipe cards, digital footprints everywhere. And yet, Phoebe just vanishes. At 6:51 p.m., she's seen on CCTV entering the apartment elevator alone, calm, barefoot, a wine glass in her hand. She presses the button. The doors close, and then nothing. No footage of her exiting. No hallway cameras catching her turn. No glimpse of her at the garbage room door. Just a blank space. A black hole in the timeline. I watched that elevator footage over and over. She doesn't look unstable, doesn't stumble, doesn't seem frantic. It's like she stepped into that elevator and evaporated. Now here's what haunts me according to the building's layout. To access the garbage chute, Phoebe would have had to exit the elevator, walk down a corridor, enter a fire door, and pull open a metal chute hatch located inside a dim, concrete garbage room. But none of that is on camera. And if you're telling me the building just happened to have blind spots that night, I'm not buying it. Something happened in those missing minutes, and whatever it was left no trace. That same evening, Phoebe sent two messages, one to her dad, one to Anthony's dad, both short, both soft. To her father, I love you, you are my anchor. To her boyfriend's father, thank you for everything, love you. Not goodbye, not help, not panic. They read like love notes sealed in a bottle tossed into the tide. But the timing is where it gets eerie. Those texts were sent after she entered the elevator, which means she was alive, still making decisions, still holding her phone. But after that radio silence, her phone stopped sending messages. Then, hours later, it was mysteriously wiped, factory reset, as if someone needed it clean, someone who knew what was on it. And as I read those last words over and over, I kept asking myself, were they hers? Or were they crafted by someone else? Someone who needed a final act of calm to cover a storm. I stood in front of it, the garbage chute, cold, still, indifferent. It was mounted on the wall of the garbage room, at least waist height, maybe higher. You'd need to hoist your body up, balance your weight, and then somehow wedge yourself inside a narrow opening no wider than a laptop screen. The hatch was heavy. I pulled it open, it resisted. Rusted hinges groaned. Sharp metal edges lined the rim. Inside, it was pitch black. Not only was it vertical, it was unforgiving. Bolts, seams, rough welding scars all down the shaft. The idea of anyone climbing in there voluntarily, drunk or sober, felt absurd. And Phoebe, she was barefoot, slightly over 5 feet tall, with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. She would have had to lift herself off the ground, crawl forward in a crouch, then deliberately let herself fall down 6 stories of darkness. I tried to imagine it. I really did. But nothing about it felt remotely human. It felt like trying to squeeze yourself into a mailbox, not impulsively, not accidentally, not even during a blackout. And here's the kicker. There were no fingerprints on the rim, no palm smears, no drag marks. Her blood was found inside the chute shaft, but not at the entry point. Which begs the question, how did she get inside? Or better yet, who put her there? The coroner's report called it a tragic accident. Phoebe was intoxicated, they said, likely in a dissociative state due to alcohol and a sleeping medication called Stilnox. In that state, she might have believed the garbage chute was a door, or a passage, or an escape. And so the theory went, she climbed in herself. Case closed. But here's what I couldn't shake. This wasn't just a theory. It was the official conclusion. Despite no footage showing her near the chute, despite her barefoot status, despite the impossible logistics, they said her alcohol level and the drug in her system explained the irrational behavior. But even then, there is a difference between irrational and impossible. I read every word of that report. Nowhere did it explain how she had the coordination to climb in. Nowhere did it explain the missing blood on the entry hatch. Nowhere did it explain the factory reset on her phone. They found her body with catastrophic injuries, but her hands barely scratched. How do you descend a 6-story metal shaft full of jagged seams without tearing up your palms? You don't, unless you never touched the hatch at all, and someone else did it for you. I went back to the forensic reports, read every line, cross-checked statements, looked for certainty. Instead, I found silence where answers should be. Let's start with the chute. The handle, no fingerprints, not Phoebe's, not anyone's. The rim, clean, too clean. No blood, no tissue, no signs of a struggle. But here's what makes it worse. Her injuries started inside the shaft. Her thighs and calves were slashed. Her feet shattered. The forensic pathologist said her legs showed deep lacerations likely caused by scraping against something sharp during a vertical fall. But how do you get shredded inside the shaft without leaving any trace on the entrance? And if she climbed in barefoot, drunk, unbalanced, how were her hands nearly uninjured? Not a single deep cut. Try climbing a garbage chute. Seriously, try it sober. Now imagine doing it with blurred vision, no shoes, and blood so toxic you should barely be standing. There's no plausible scenario where she enters that chute alone and leaves no physical evidence on the hatch. Unless someone else opened it, someone else lifted her, and wiped it down. Here's what chilled me to the bone. Phoebe's phone was recovered, but not as she left it. Hours after her body was discovered, after she had already been declared dead, her iPhone was mysteriously wiped. Factory reset. All texts, all call logs, all app data gone. It didn't just crash, it was deliberately erased. And according to the phone model and iOS at the time, that reset required time, intent, and the passcode, or someone who knew how to force a wipe. So I asked the obvious question: who had access? Her boyfriend Anthony claimed he never touched it. Her family never even saw it. The police? They couldn't confirm who handled it during the first critical hours of the investigation. No log, no record, just gone. This wasn't just a missing device. This was a missing timeline. Gone were the last texts Phoebe might have written. Gone were her voicemails. Gone were any panicked calls, notes, screenshots. Everything that might have told us what happened in those final moments, wiped like it never existed. And no one, not one person, has ever admitted to doing it. That's not an accident, that's a message. Someone didn't just silence Phoebe, they silenced her story. Anthony Hampel told police he came home around 6 p.m. He noticed broken glass in the kitchen, the apartment door ajar, the dog Yoshi pacing nervously. But according to him, nothing seemed off. He assumed Phoebe had gone out for a walk, or to run errands, maybe to clear her head. So he left again, went to the gym. Let me pause there. A woman you live with leaves a mess behind shattered glass, a loose dog, the front door unlatched, and your instinct is to go work out. You don't call her, don't text, don't check the garbage room. And the most critical part? The chute where Phoebe's body was found is directly beneath their apartment. She would have hit the compactor sometime between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. with a thunderous crash that echoed through the garbage shaft and into the basement. Anthony was home just before that, then again after, and yet he claims he didn't hear a thing. Sound tests later proved that a body hitting that compactor would have made a noise loud enough to rattle the chute doors on every floor. But Anthony, he heard nothing. Sometimes it's not what people say that raises suspicion, it's what they don't react to. Phoebe's grandfather, Lorne Campbell, wasn't just any grieving relative. He was a decorated, retired homicide detective, sharp, relentless, not someone easily dismissed. And the moment he read the coroner's findings, he knew something was wrong. He challenged the ruling, loudly, publicly, called out inconsistencies, pointed to the lack of proper scene preservation, missing fingerprints, the inexplicable phone wipe, but it didn't matter. The media leaned on the troubled young woman narrative. The police accepted the accidental death theory. So the family took matters into their own hands. They hired forensic experts, private investigators, reconstructed the chute, ran physical reenactments with women of similar height and weight. Result? Every expert said the same thing. It was physically possible, yes, but extremely unlikely, especially for someone in Phoebe's condition. They pushed for an inquest. They begged for a reopening of the case. But the machinery of the justice system had already locked into place. Accident, case closed. And still, her grandfather stood firm. "I know what a crime scene looks like," he said, and this was a crime scene. But sometimes, even when you shout the truth, the silence is louder. The forensic report listed something that most people skim right past. Phoebe's fingerprints were found on exactly one elevator button, the 12th floor. And at first, that seems unremarkable. That's where she lived. But the detail that hit me was this: she was already on the 12th floor. So why press it again? Elevator buttons don't register if you're already on that level, which means either she hit it by mistake or she was trying to go up. But here's the thing: Phoebe's body was later found 6 floors down in the garbage room in the basement. So why would she be trying to go higher? Was someone else in the elevator with her? Did she press it as a reflex out of panic? Or was she trying to avoid going to a lower level? No other fingerprints were found on the panel, just hers. But maybe that's the scariest part. Because sometimes silence doesn't mean nothing happened. It means someone cleaned up. In a building that size 43 luxury floors, there's always someone watching. That night, there was a security guard on duty. He was the first person on the scene after Phoebe's body was discovered. But his statements, vague, incomplete, and something about that set off alarm bells for me. He was never formally interviewed by detectives. His name barely appears in the official timeline, and yet he was there. He saw the scene before police locked it down. He walked the halls, maybe even rode the elevator. Then just a week later, he was transferred. No reason given, no follow-up, no record of internal notes from the company he worked for. And when Phoebe's family tried to track him down, nothing. No returned calls, no public comments. He just disappeared from the story, which raises a terrifying question: did he see something? Or worse, did someone make sure he didn't talk about it? One person with keys, with access, with knowledge of every blind spot in the building, gone, and no one ever asked why. I tracked down notes from Phoebe's therapy sessions, not rumors, not speculation, real documents. Months before her death, Phoebe told her psychiatrist something chilling. She said she felt like she was being silenced, that her life wasn't her own anymore, that her voice was being muted, her choices controlled. She used the word trapped. She also described dreams, recurring ones of falling, not tripping, not jumping, just falling, as if the ground had vanished beneath her. The psychiatrist noted dissociation, a fraying sense of reality, but also something else: coercive control. Phoebe reportedly felt watched, judged. She expressed anxiety about her relationship, but was vague, as if unsure whether it was emotional abuse or just her own spiraling. That's the part that broke me. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know if the danger was coming from within her or from someone she loved. And that confusion, that's where so many victims get stuck on the line between fear and loyalty. When investigators entered the apartment, it felt like someone had pressed pause on a scene. Two wine glasses sat on the kitchen counter, one half full, the other with lipstick smudges. A single candle still burned. The room smelled faintly of incense and red wine. Then there was the mirror, shattered, sharp shards scattered across the bathroom floor. This wasn't just a lived-in space. It felt staged, or like something had just happened. Was it a quiet evening alone, a setup for something planned, or the aftermath of an argument that turned cold and final? No fingerprints on the glasses, no prints on the wine bottle. Anthony said he hadn't returned until much later, but the wine was fresh. There were no signs of forced entry, no security footage of anyone else entering the unit. And yet, the apartment told a story, one of tension, of ritual, or maybe of closure. But closure for who? I kept circling back to Anthony, the boyfriend, the last one to see her alive. On paper, he was clean, no charges, no known history of violence. But Phoebe's friends painted a different picture. They said he was meticulous, emotionally detached, the kind of man who didn't yell but who could make you question your own sanity. One of his former partners described him as manipulative, like a lawyer, not a lover. Another said he could twist any conversation into a trap. You'd leave the room thinking everything was fine until you realized you just apologized for something that wasn't your fault. Phoebe once wrote in her journal, "I am a prisoner in my own head, and someone else has the key." We may never prove that Anthony pushed her, that he erased her phone, that he stood in that apartment while the wine went warm. But when I look at all the pieces, the timeline gaps, the missing evidence, the silence, one thing becomes clear. Somebody knows what happened, and that somebody never spoke. Phoebe Hansjock didn't die in a garbage chute. She died in the hours before, in the silences, in the red flags ignored, in the surveillance footage that should exist but doesn't. And still, after all this time, 3 questions refused to leave me alone. Who wiped her phone? Why was the chute spotless, sterile, as if cleaned? And if it wasn't an accident, who else was in that apartment with her that night? Until those questions are answered, this isn't just an unsolved case. It's a warning. Because sometimes what kills you isn't the fall. It's everything that leads up to it.